Hello, my name is Vint Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. Today I'd like to spend some time talking about the design and the architecture of the Internet and the policy implications of those topics. When Bob Kahn and I began work on the Internet 50 years ago in 1973, our intent was to design a technology that would allow an arbitrarily large number of independent networks to be interconnected together into a mesh and to interoperate, providing users with access to every possible termination in the collection of networks. Connectivity was everything. The whole idea was that anyone could essentially connect to anyone else on the network, or any machine could connect with any other machine on the network. It's not too different from the telephone system where you're basically allowed to call anyone. Of course, the called party doesn't have to answer, or they can hang up. And the same is true in the Internet. You don't have to accept a request to connect, or once a connection is established, if you conclude that the connection is inappropriate, you can basically break the connection. So the basic idea is that all users of the various networks on the Internet have access to all the resources of the network. Of course, many of you will remember that the original design was intended to satisfy the requirements of a command and control network for the United States and its allies. The idea was that the allies would construct similar networks, they'd all be interconnected, and they would cooperate. Of course, as time has gone on since that 50-year beginning, commercialization has happened, and we'll come to some of the implications of that in just a few minutes. The Internet's success was based on an earlier network success, and that was the ARPANET, which tested the idea that computer communication could be successfully achieved using packet switching technology, which at the time, in the late 1960s, was considered heretical among most of the telecommunications engineers. Bob and I did not try to dictate any particular business model for any of the constituent networks of the Internet. We thought that was their business. It could be commercial, it could be government run, it could be nonprofit, or some other combination. It didn't matter. The whole idea was that they all followed the same set of standards, TCP/IP protocol suite, all adopted the same IP address structure and the same kind of routing technologies. Internally, each network could have its own routing technology, but between the networks, a single network routing system called the Border Gateway Protocol was adopted in order to create a uniform connectivity throughout the system. Until 1988, the Internet consisted of mostly government-operated and owned networks. But around 1988, it became apparent that this technology had uses in the commercial sector, in the private sector, and even for the general public. I became a great proponent of trying to make the Internet commercially available. And by 1989, at least in the United States, there were 3 commercial Internet services, UUNet, PSINet, and SurfNet, all operating within the confines of the United States and interconnecting with several of the U.S. government-owned networks. The original ARPANET, the NASA Science Internet, the NSFNet backbone, and the Energy Services Network from the Department of Energy. And of course, in those time frames in the late 1980s, we began to see other networks arising, some government-supported and some private sector outside of the U.S., in Europe in particular, and Asia-Pac, and eventually in other parts of the world. During the course of all of that evolution, the system grew in an organic way, which is exactly what we all hoped it could do. And perhaps more important, it evolved a variety of institutions to help manage the allocation of resources, IP address space and domain names as an example. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers was created in 1998. The Internet Society was created in 1992 to help support the Internet Engineering Task Force, which did the basic standardization of the protocols. The Internet Architecture Board, which oversaw the general trends and evolution of the Internet's architecture. A number of other institutions were created, regional Internet registries to reallocate IP addresses, the root servers to handle the core zone functions of the domain name system, and on and on. The whole idea here is that many of these institutions were created at need as opposed to the very beginning 50 years ago. That's an important part of the internet story, which is its adaptation to change, its adaptation to new requirements. New protocols were created in this layered architecture, and indeed, one of the most important new layers that was added is called Hypertext Transport Protocol, which was announced in late 1991 by now Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the co-inventor of the World Wide Web. That layer of protocol created an enormous opportunity for the creation and sharing of content throughout the network. And here I have to emphasize the importance of connectivity in the context of the World Wide Web. The openness of the World Wide Web created opportunities to generate and share and discover information of interest all around the world. The whole idea was that the internet would display a kind of uniformity so that anyone anywhere could get access to the same kinds of information. Of course, there was so much information that eventually search engines had to be created. Alta Vista, for example, was one of the earlier ones. Yahoo came along, then came Google, then came Bing, and there are others, of course, as you well know. The important thing to emphasize is that the value of the network is partly a function of its openness, of the accessibility of its content. This doesn't stop parties from imposing what we call paywalls between user and information that the provider wishes to be compensated for. But it's quite astonishing to find how much information is readily available online. And in fact, part of the reason the internet has been so valuable is precisely because of its open character and the fact that so much information is readily accessible and indexable by the search engines of the day. Well, now I come to a part where there is policy debate over how the internet should continue to evolve. Some parties take the view that an ISP is somehow a two-sided market. I don't agree with this. I think that there is only one side to the ISP, essentially its users, its customers, its subscribers. It essentially provides them with access to the internet, with access to all of the other parties who are on that same ISP's network, and access to the rest of the internet, either through the ISP's peering relationships with the thousands, if not tens of thousands of other networks around the net, or an ISP that has peers that it directly connects to and transit services which it purchases from other ISPs in order to reach the entire internet. That's its purpose, is to deliver to its subscribers access to the entire internet and, by extension, the entire World Wide Web. I believe there's only one side to this market, and that's the subscriber side. When Bob and I were doing the original design, we made no restrictions on what business models would be adopted, and of course there's plenty of room for variation, as I'm sure every one of you knows. What I don't think is appropriate or helpful is to discriminate among the various potential application service providers or other customers of a particular network and interfering with user choice. I mean, the whole point behind the design was that the users of the net would have comparable choices no matter which internet service provider they were using. They had common and equal access to all the services of any particular ISP that they're subscribed to. And that should be uniformly true. It does not mean that there can't be differential charging. For example, most networks, if they charge at all, will charge a varying amount depending on the speed of the service that the internet is, the ISP is providing, or perhaps the latency of the service. At very low latency might have a higher charge associated with it. But every user of the network has the same access to any of the available services that the ISP offers. And the ISP doesn't distinguish or discriminate otherwise or interfere with access by a subscriber to any of the services it offers or any of the destinations that are available on the internet. At least that's the original design principle, and in large measure that holds today. Some of the proposals to discriminate among some of the application service providers or users of a particular network and to somehow discriminate between them and others really breaks the original internet model from 50 years ago and today. The whole point is neutrality in terms of the access to services that users should experience, and no application service provider should be discriminated against by any of the networks of the internet. Those networks are responsible for allowing any of their users to get access to any of the application service providers anywhere on the global internet. None of these considerations should allow an ISP to differentiate and discriminate against any of the application service providers anywhere in the world, especially those with whom they do not have a business relationship. Some application service providers are subscribers to a particular internet service provider's services. They should have the same rights and privileges of any other user of that ISP. And certainly, no application service provider should be discriminated against merely because of scale or size or any other parameter. They should have equal access to all the services that are available on equal terms and conditions. As I said before, that doesn't mean that there can't be charges for higher speeds or charges for other parameters, but that should be accessible. Those various services should be accessible to everyone on the same terms and conditions. Here I want to make a very clear distinction between an application service provider, which is a subscriber of a given ISP and should be treated comparably as any other subscriber, and an application service provider that's on another network, a separate network, independent of any particular ISP. That application service provider does not have nexus and does not get service directly from an ISP that might serve a subscriber. We should distinguish between those two kinds of circumstances and not impose on an application service provider that does not have nexus with the ISP any terms and conditions. It makes absolutely no sense at all to imagine that every application service provider on any network in the internet suddenly should be regarded as having nexus with every ISP in the internet. There's simply no implementable way of dealing with that kind of a model, and I would urge policymakers to take that into account. Much of what's going on in the debate today about differential charging or two-sided markets, in fact, is a highly discriminatory policy which seriously interferes with the openness of the internet, which has given it such value. And here I have to urge policymakers to give serious thought to the potential damage this kind of discriminatory policy could have on the operation of the global internet. This is a time when, after 50 years of design and 40 years of operation, we should remember the values that have been demonstrated in this open and equally accessible internet. And we should try very hard to preserve those values for the benefit of those who have yet to be connected to this incredible service and who deserve equal access to it on the same terms and conditions as everyone else. Thanks for listening.